The baby's cry cut through the cabin like a siren, sharp and relentless, each wail fraying nerves and sparking groans from weary passengers. In seat 2A sat Cyrus Valdez, a billionaire who had mastered impossible deals but was utterly helpless with a 6-month-old in his arms. Eyes turned, whispers spread, and the world seemed to shrink into judgment and noise. Just as the flight threatened to collapse under impatience, a shy 17-year-old girl stood from economy, clutching her mother's worn shawl, about to do something no one expected. It started as a whisper of a wail at the gate, that thin, teetering cry babies make when they are still trying to decide whether the world will listen. Then the boarding doors opened, the jet bridge gulped them down, and the wail clawed into the cabin like a siren, sharp and helpless and relentless. Familiar groans rose as people filed past, shoulders tightening, eyes flitting toward the sound. The flight attendant, high pony smile glued on with optimism, said, "Welcome aboard," in the bright tone that always felt a little like a dare. The world listened, the world winced, and the baby screamed harder. In 2A sat a man whose photo had been on magazine covers and investment websites, a man whose name had become shorthand for impossible deals done overnight. Cyrus Valdez had turned a late-night messaging app for call center teams into a multinational communications platform, and then turned that into a portfolio of holding companies nobody could quite diagram. He was not the sort of person who expected to be recognized, so much as he expected to be obeyed, and yet when the cries ricocheted through the business class cabin, and 1,000 tiny glass panes of anonymous judgment glittered at him, he flinched like anyone else. He stood up because sitting made the screams louder. He jostled the baby because stillness made the screams angrier. He tried shushing. He tried bouncing. He tried the helpless papa dance men do when their arms remember the shape of a partner they loved and lost. There, Noah," he whispered, though he had never before used that soothing tone with anyone in his life, not even with the woman whose absence still gnawed at him like missed lunch. "We're almost settled. We're almost—" Hey! Noah arched in his arms, red-faced and furious. Passengers swiveled, craning. Someone muttered about noise. Someone else sighed theatrically, the sigh of a person who wants a witness. Cyrus met eyes he could not name and saw the whole lovely economy of air travel tumble, the promise of a glass of quiet, the promise of a nap in a moving room, the promise that your seat assignment insulated you from the animal chaos babies always bring. He had promised himself this too, that despite everything, he could pull off this trip alone, that he could be both billionaire and beginner father, that he could tuck one day into another like clean shirts and fly to Tokyo and land with a contract signed and a child still intact. "Can I bring you anything?" the flight attendant asked gingerly, like every word was an eggshell she had to balance on. "Warm water for a bottle? A blanket?" "He won't take the bottle," Cyrus said, throat tight. "He won't do anything. I'm sorry." The apology felt strange in his mouth, earnest and jagged. He had said sorry perfunctorily in interviews for delays and roadmaps and supply chain snarls, the mannered shrug of a CEO who knows words cost less than fixes. This sorry came from somewhere raw, and because the admission made him feel skinned, he pivoted toward anger, that old safe house. He had asked the nanny to come. Her mother had been hospitalized at noon. He had told his assistant to find another. The assistant had cried. He had told himself that men had been doing this since the beginning of time, that a crying baby on an airplane wasn't an emergency, just a test. The world does not always give you the tests you trained for. "Sir," the attendant said, "we'll see if he settles once we push back." She smiled at the baby with practiced tenderness, but the baby did not care about practice. The baby let out a single shriek that seemed to split along the spine of the plane and then broke into sobbing hiccups that reached past the bulkhead, past the galley, into economy, where elbows were already arguing about armrests. In 12D, a girl who planned her life in quiet held her backpack closer and watched. She had chosen the aisle because Windows made her feel trapped, and because she was the sort of person who needed to know how quickly she could stand and leave a thing if leaving became imperative. She had a notebook tucked into the seat pocket in front of her, its margins full of small ink-blue lullabies and grocery lists, the two always sharing a sheet. Her hair was pulled into a loop she could undo with a breath. She had that kind of face people call sweet, because they cannot find a way to call it brave. Leah Morales had spent most of her 17 years learning how not to be noticed. She was good at folding her long limbs into narrower shapes, at apologizing with a look, at laughing just after everyone else so it could be mistaken for echo. She had a scholarship letter in her bag to a conservatory in Singapore she'd accepted without telling her father he would miss her more than he ever let on. She had a shawl her mother left behind, cotton worn thin at the edges, clean but forever threaded with the faint scent of sampaguita and baby lotion from when her brother was still alive. She had a voice she rarely let loose in front of strangers, though it filled the small tiled bathroom at home like warm steam. She had a terror of flying she attempted to trick by naming each step of the safety demonstration in her head as the stewardess recited them: seatbelt, exit lights, oxygen masks descending like ghost jellyfish, glide, slide, brace. She had a lullaby her mother used to sing on market nights when heat plastered shirts to skin and even the dogs refused to bark. A lullaby about rain finally giving in. The baby in business class did not know about her voice or her shawl or her scholarship letter. The baby only knew air and ache. But Leah knew babies, not in the way of certificate and clinical terms, though she'd read about the 5 S's and the tricks nurses taught exhausted new parents, but in the way of hours. Hours walking her neighbor's colicky newborn up and down the alley, hours crouched in the hallway outside her father's room the day her mom's heart failed, pressing a damp cloth to her own neck to cool down the panic, hours humming to herself so the house would not feel like a scream. She watched the man in 2A, watched his mouth form sorry, and then stop making words altogether. He was rich. That way of carrying himself that said the world had never asked him to wait long for anything except grief. He was also obvious in his undoing. The look on his face was not just father panic, though it wore that too. It was the wild-eyed confusion of somebody more used to bending reality than being benched by it. She could feel the whole cabin recalibrating in response. There were people who hated him on sight because the newspaper had taught them to. People who would have hated any crying baby, no matter if the parent wore a price tag or not. People who would never say a word but would remember this as the ruin of a nap. And people like her who felt every cry as a chime in a pocket watch only they carried, ticking, ticking. Her fingers found her mother's shawl. She pressed it to her face for an instant, the tiniest inhale, and felt calm arrive the way smells always bring back rooms and afternoons with the exact shade of the light. The cry knotted again. She unclipped her belt. "It's none of your business," she told herself. "He's in business class. The attendants will help. The baby will tire. If you stand up, people will stare. If you walk forward, someone will think you're stupid. If you open your mouth, your voice will come out wrong. Sit, stay small. Let the world be loud without you." The baby screamed like refusal of an entire planet. A woman across the aisle pressed her fingers to her temples. A man rang his call button with venom. Leah stood. Her knees were soft. She thought of the white molded oxygen mask in the safety speech and of the line about putting on your own before assisting others, a suggestion she had always taken as cruel until she tried to breathe on days when it felt like someone had swapped her lungs for sponges. She moved down the aisle in the tight shuffle of humanity, murmuring apology when she brushed bags and elbows, glancing up once to see the flight attendant at the galley speaking into a phone and throwing an anxious look forward. When she reached the curtain that severed the cabin into classes, she stopped because a rule is a rule until you make yourself a door. "Miss?" The attendant at the partition lifted a hand as if to stop her gently, the way you calm a dreaming animal so it does not wake. "Can I help you?" Leah's mouth was cotton. She swallowed. "I think I can help the baby." The attendant's smile was professional and edged with fatigue, the kind that says her knees had been holding up strangers for 12 hours already today and would keep doing it tomorrow. "Do you have family up here?" "No," Leah said, "but I can help if you let me try, please." "What makes you think that?" People rarely asked her that, and the question startled her with its generosity. She could have said, "I read about it," or "I've done this with my neighbor's child for months," or "I know this crying from the inside out, I swear I do." Instead, she lifted the shawl a little and said, "This smells like Mother. Not his mother, I know, but it smells like Mother, and I can hum." The attendant blinked. Behind her, the baby wailed, then hiccuped, then launched again. The attendant bit her lip. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, but only if Dad says yes." They parted the curtain. Business class was a dim room of nylon and money, and people who did not know whether to be grateful for the intervention or offended. 2A looked up. He had moved to the space near the bulkhead where there was room to pace, and he was doing that relentless joggle with the baby in his arms, a desperate dance that would wear the tendons of his elbows raw. His face, she recognized him dimly from tech headlines, but the name didn't matter here, was wet. Not from tears exactly, but from the effort of being a person holding on with his whole body. "Sir," the attendant said, almost whispering to keep from startling the screaming infant, "this young lady would like to help. She says she—" "Please," he said, cutting her and himself off. "Please, anything." He looked at Leah. His eyes were not the eyes of a man who asked people for help easily. "Please." "I don't know how to make him stop. I don't know what I'm doing." Leah nodded. She introduced herself in a voice that barely rose above the crying, then raised her hands the way one does toward a skittish cat, palms out, slow, permission. "May I?" He hesitated. It only lasted an instant, and in that instant the cabin held its collective breath. Then he nodded and shifted the baby into her arms. The weight was immediate and perfect, a thunder of heat and trust. Noah, he had said the name without realizing it, pinwheeled tiny limbs, shrugged in outrage, and then found her collarbone with the hard round of his forehead. She turned him sideways, snug, her palm under his diapered bottom, other hand cupping the back of his head where the hair grew in cowlick swirls. She swayed, not the panicky bounce, but the ocean sway she had learned in a hallway, with her neighbor asleep in a chair and her own legs numb. She put her lips near the baby's ear and made a sound that would have been a whisper if it were quieter in that cabin. It was the shoosh of rain and blood and a shell pressed to the ear, the soft insistence of a storm starting offshore. She met the eyes of the father over the baby's downy head and said softly, "It's very loud. But to him it will feel like home if I am louder for a little while." She drew the shawl from her shoulder and draped it over Noah's back like a tiny sky. The cotton smelled like a summer she could not ever go back to, and for a moment she could not stand under the weight of it. She steadied herself with one more sway. She made the shh bigger, then smaller. She patted Noah's bum in a rhythm like footsteps. She shifted him to his side. She tucked his arms in tighter. She fed him the edge of the shawl to suck for a moment as his mouth hunted in midair, then swapped it for his pacifier with a soft sleight of hand and a murmured apology to the cloth. She hummed the tune that had carried her through market nights. 3 notes up like a hand rising to knock 1 note down like a sigh repeat. She did not sing words. Words were for people who didn't need to be convinced that breathing happened next. It took 60 seconds for the scream to waver, 90 for the hiccups to replace the shrieks, 2 minutes for the tiny body to shudder, then melt, to be heavy where it had been rigid, to surrender to the thing older than airplanes and boardrooms. The baby sighed that miraculous baby sigh and slept. The cabin exhaled. Leah kept swaying. The movement wasn't about him anymore. It was about keeping herself from crying with him. She had done this before, in bedrooms where curtains moved like slow ghosts and fans made shadows. But doing it here, under the eyes of strangers and money and a father made of public headlines, pushed something in her chest to the brink. She squeezed it back in with one more hum. She glanced at the father. He had both hands up like he wanted to catch a blessing. His mouth was open a little. He looked like a man who had been handed proof of the existence of angels, and the proof weighed about 6 kilograms and smelled like milk. How? He whispered, as if even the awe in his voice might wake the sleeping thing. How did you do that? Mother, she said simply, and he flinched as if she had stuck him with a pin. It was not a word he allowed inside him easily. It rearranged furniture when it entered. She held the shawl closer around the baby and did not say the rest, that sometimes what calms isn't the person you lost, but a thread between worlds that smells like them. She added, he'll need to suck during takeoff. His ears will pop. If he won't take the bottle, your finger clean. Nail down, pad up. Her voice was soft, the rhythm of instructions borrowed from midwives and grandmothers, and articles read at 2 in the morning on a cracked phone under a crocheted blanket. He nodded, grateful, as a student taking notes. Thank you, he swallowed. What's your name? Leah. Leah, he repeated, as if he were tasting it for future use. I know, she said, then blushed. I think I've seen you on... She gestured vaguely at the invisible plane of screens. He almost smiled. Almost. I'm sorry, he said again. And this time it was and wasn't about the same things. It was about the last year and the way his life had become a kingdom with a piece missing. About the fact that he had thought money could buy competence and then discovered it did not rent courage. I'm sorry for all this. Babies cry, she said, and it was the most radical thing anyone had said to him in months. She glanced toward the attendant. May I stay here a little, just until takeoff? He might wake if he moves too much. The attendant looked at the sleeping angel, and then at the man in 2A, and then at Leah, whose body made a shape the baby liked. You can sit in the jump seat by the galley for now, she said. I'll bring a blanket to cushion your arm. For the first time since they boarded, Cyrus sat. He watched the girl move to the jump seat, watched the triangle of her body and the bundle she cradled, watched the shawl's edge flutter with the plane's recycled breeze. He had the sensation he sometimes had in boardrooms where numbers finally lined up, that click of a lock opening. A pale quiet folded itself into the cabin. He could hear his own heart. He could feel his own helplessness, too, the way he had been living beside it like an unwelcome roommate and pretending he didn't hear it pacing at night. The plane pushed back. The baby stirred and whimpered. Leah guided the tiny mouth around a gloved knuckle and sang the ghost of a tune. The engines rose in a hum that sounded like bees acquiring confidence. During climb, a man in 3C leaned over and said to Cyrus, "Congratulations," in the tone people use when they want to be on the right side of a story in case it becomes one. Cyrus nodded, something like ironic laughter pressing against his ribs. He remembered the day he had announced Noah's birth to his board, a neat email with the word joy in it, followed 3 hours later by a call from the surgeon to tell him that the joy and the woman who carried it had only intersected for a blink. He had thought he could build a bridge between those facts across which a cheerful professionalism could pass. The bridge had collapsed, as bridges do when grief plants dynamite at the middle and waits. When the seat belt light pinged off, the attendant let Leah move closer again. Cyrus watched her cradle the baby as if she had been hired for this at birth. It occurred to him he had never held any other human being with such faith in his life. As he held this child, faith that he would not drop, faith that he would not fail, faith that he understood the stakes. He had negotiated with men whose names inked headlines and never been asked to surrender pride the way this small knot of personhood demanded he do daily. "Would you—" he started, then stopped. You could not hire kindness. You could hire nannies with degrees and MMR shots. You could hire consultants on sleep training. You could hire a PR team to keep photos of your bad days off the internet. You could not hire a shy girl's shawl that smelled like someone else's childhood, or the kind of courage that makes a person stand up and walk toward awkwardness for someone she's never met. Would I what? Leah asked softly. Teach me, he said. Not all at once, but this, the S's, how you knew to... I don't know how, not to be a stranger to my son. He had not called him my son out loud in days. The phrase landed between them like a small warm bird and chose not to fly away. Leah smiled in surprise that didn't flatten into false modesty. I can show you the hold I use, she said, and the shush, and how to swaddle with a blanket that's too small because the good ones are always in the wash. She paused. You'll find your way. He will help. They made a small room out of that corner near the galley, a room within a room that smelled like coffee and baby breath and metal. Leah demonstrated the side stomach hold. Cyrus watched, tried, failed, tried again, and felt Noah relax against his unsure hands. She showed him the rhythm for the pat, a metronome disguised as a palm, not random but heartbeat steady. He was a fast learner in boardrooms. He learned slowly and awkwardly here, and found the awkwardness oddly humanizing. He likes the shawl, he said suddenly, almost accusingly, because he wanted to name the magic he couldn't replicate. It's special. It was my mother's, Leah said, and for the first time her voice wobbled a little. She passed last year. A silence bloomed that wasn't empty. He nodded, and it was the nod of someone recognizing the shape of another's whole. He wanted to ask 100 things, but did not. Instead, he said, "Thank you for sharing it with him." "I can leave it with you," she said. He looked at the shawl as if it were a relic. "I can't take that." "You can borrow it," she countered, "until he doesn't need it. The scent will fade. It already has. But sometimes you only need the idea of a thing." "Isn't that the definition of faith?" he asked before he could stop himself. The question lingered between them like a joke nobody wanted to laugh at. She smiled, small and soft. The hours of the flight settled into a pattern that felt a little like prayer. The cabin dimmed further. People who had imagined they would be angry returned to their movies. People who had been angry fell asleep and forgot they were. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisles with the economy of dancers. The world outside the windows was all cloud, the indifferent largeness that makes human noise seem like punctuation. Leah held Noah for a while and then handed him to Cyrus with the kind of trust that educates. Cyrus, who was used to managing risk and being praised for it, held risk personified and looked a little stunned by the fact that nobody would give him a trophy for simply not dropping anything. At some point, the shy girl and the millionaire began to talk. Not the way people do when they are networking, perhaps for the simple reason that what could either of them trade? He asked about her family. She answered, a father who fixed fans and radios and sometimes left screws like breadcrumbs from the door to his workbench. A little brother, Mateo, who had come early and left sooner, a mother who had sung through everything. She asked nothing about his company. He told her anyway about the line of code he had written at 3 a.m. years ago that changed a server's capacity, and hence a city's, and how none of it made sense measured against the weight of his son's head on his chest. "What do you plan to study?" he asked finally, because the shawl and the tune and the teaching had gathered into an idea that made him hopeful. "Composition," she said, "and community health. I want to make music for tiny rooms where people are hurting. It's a strange ambition." "It seems perfect," he said, and meant it more fiercely than a man like him was supposed to mean anything that didn't have a revenue model. Later, when the lights bled into a suggestion of morning and the cabin stirred from its collective half-sleep, when announcements of descent brought tray tables upright and hearts back into the gravity of land, Noah awoke. He fussed, the time-honored baby habit of objecting to a pressure change. Leah showed Cyrus the trick of the finger again, and he did it with the new shy confidence of a person who has practiced something and seen it work. The baby settled. The plane's wheels kissed runway. It was only then that the unthinkable part unfolded fully. Not the swaddling she'd improvised with the airline blanket, not the way she had walked into a richer room to make herself a person anyone could thank, not the hum or the patience. Those were extraordinary acts folded into ordinary gestures. The unthinkable thing was smaller and more brutal. She tried to hand the shawl back and then asked him to take it. For a while, she said, as they stood in the aisle with carry-ons crushing past their knees, until he sleeps without it. "I can't," he said again. "You can," she insisted. "You know what I mean." "My mother would want it to help someone," her mouth trembled. "I want it to help someone. Please, don't make it about ownership. Make it about use." He understood the kind of sacrifice that makes a person breathe shallow. He took the shawl slowly, reverently, as if it were both fabric and a set of invisible instructions for love. "How will I get it back to you?" "You won't," she said, and almost laughed at the face he made. "One day you'll realize it has stopped smelling like anything except your laundry soap. You'll think, this is just a cloth. Then you'll give it to someone else." He looked startled at the idea of being asked to become part of a chain. He looked for a second wounded by the knowledge that not everything could be kept. Then he nodded like a man accepting a covenant. "I'll do that," he said. "I promise." They separated with the awkward ballet of deplaning, with strangers blocking and bags swinging. He tried to ask her one more thing, her contact information, something more concrete than a name whispered in a corridor of altitude. But the current of people pulled them apart. He saw the back of her head disappearing down the jet bridge, the thin strap of her backpack digging into one shoulder. He pressed his mouth to his son's hair and inhaled the shawl's fading flowers. On the ride to his hotel, in a car that smelled like leather and the effort of neutral luxury, he wrote a message to his assistant and then deleted it 3 times. He had never in his life used his money to find a stranger who did not wish to be found. He had always believed anonymity to be dignity's right, but he had also never before encountered the precise temptation of wanting to thank someone in a way that could dent their future for the better. In the end, he sent a different kind of message altogether, one to his foundation's director asking her to meet with him first thing to discuss something that made no financial sense. By the time he signed the paper in Tokyo, a deal that would have made a younger version of him raise a glass but now felt like ink muttering, it had begun to take shape. He drafted a program with his team on the flight home, his knee bouncing, the baby strapped to him in a carrier, asleep with a fist of shawl near his mouth. He called it the Lullaby Initiative because naming things has power. A partnership with hospitals to train volunteers in comforting techniques for newborns. A fund for students with strange ambitions that braided the arts and care. Small rooms retrofitted in clinics where sound and scent were reconsidered as medicine. He had never cared about naming rights. He began to now, but only because attaching a name could turn a barely seen quiet labor into an institution that might outlast him. The press release, days later, used words like visionary and compassionate and unique. He let the words do their job of creating a fog. He did not say to cameras that a girl on a plane had rearranged his molecules. He asked his foundation director to find her, not by hiring a private investigator, but by calling the airline, explaining that a passenger had done something extraordinary for a child and that gratitude should find its address if it could be done with respect. The airline called the flight attendants. The one with the high ponytail remembered the girl's seat number. The airline sent a letter to that seat's booking contact. The contact, a travel agency Leah's conservatory had used to purchase discount student fares, forwarded a note to the school. The school, after much careful screening of what seemed like a very rich man's interest in a very fragile student, asked Leah if she would like to meet someone from a foundation about a scholarship that had been suddenly created, as if the world itself had wanted her to keep singing. Meanwhile, Leah returned to a house where the morning light touched every object like a secret. Her father was at the workbench fussing with an old radio that had belonged to a neighbor and made only static and memory. He looked up when she came in, and his eyes softened and made her bite her lip. She told him about the baby on the plane in broad strokes because she could not yet manage the fine lines, and he nodded like a person who believes the world still surprises. She did not tell him about the shawl. She did not tell him she had left it with a man she did not know. She touched the place on her shoulder where it usually warmed her and felt the absence like a bruise, then like a blessing. The letter from the conservatory came in an email 3 days later, subject line neutral, body text simple. Would she be willing to meet with the representatives of the Valdez Foundation to discuss an award for students bridging music and public health? She read the words twice and then looked up the man's name online, saw photos of him stepping out of cars with glass doors attached, saw the clean, sharp lines of his haircut, and a low-resolution image of him carrying a baby. Comments below had been vicious and kind in equal measure, the way the internet always is, and she shut the laptop as if it might reach out and take her face in its cold hands. She went to the meeting in a blouse her father ironed so carefully you could have rolled a napkin through the seam. She brought her notebook because if she needed to hide behind something, paper with songs on it was the most honest wall she had. The conference room was chilled and too white, the kind of room that takes warmth hostage and bills by the hour. The foundation director was there, a woman whose voice could soothe owls out of trees, and Cyrus was there holding his son, who chewed placidly on the corner of a teething ring, and then smiled at her with the dreamy aimlessness of infants. For the second time, something invisible opened. "I brought it," Cyrus said first, and held out the shawl. "I borrowed it, like you said." He did not add, "Every night when panic came, I held it too. It's yours." "It was my mother's," she said, and she held it to her face, and inhaled a scent that had altered, not gone, transformed by someone else's sleep into a story of continuation rather than ending. It still is. But maybe now it belongs to a few more people. She folded it and set it on the table gently, as if even wood could bruise it. Noah gurgled, that happiness babies have when they're fed, and the room is full of faces. So much of his face looked like his mother's. Stranger after stranger had told Cyrus this, sometimes with the compassion of midwives and sometimes with the cruelty of comparison. But when Leah said, "He has her eyes," it did not sting. It made a new kind of sense, as if someone had translated grief into a language his chest could speak. "I wanted to thank you," he said, not with a press release, with something that might make the next version of this story easier for someone else. He gestured to the foundation director. "We've established an initiative in your name, not to pin you to it, but to let other people volunteer where their music meets need, and personally, if you want it, a scholarship, full ride, composition, and community health. Singapore." Leah's breath hitched. She looked at the director's face as if it might tell her this was a joke. She looked at the baby because babies have no reason to lie. She looked at the shawl and thought of how her mother used to tie it around her own hair with a bow that always slipped. She wanted to say a litany of polite phrases. "Thank you, you shouldn't have. It's too much. I can't accept. Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure?" But what came out was the simple truth. "I don't know how to be as brave as I was on the plane every day," she said, voice low, "but I can try." "That's all any of us do," he said softly. They set up the details with the boring beauty of paperwork because even miracles must make friends with forms. She went home and told her father. He hugged her so hard she wheezed and then pretended he had meant to do that because fathers can't stand it when they scare their children even with love. She walked to her neighbor's house and held the newborn who had kept her sane last year and sang the lullaby again, the tune now weighted with new rooms. Months later, in a hospital wing painted the color of the inside of a seashell, someone had attached her name to a tiny space meant for rocking and sound. Posters on the walls taught the 5 S's in cheerful fonts. A borrowed CD player, nobody had budgeted for better yet, looped a playlist Leah had assembled, songs with heartbeats hidden inside them, songs with brass that didn't bully, songs with flutes like soft wind. Mothers with tired faces came in and rested because the chairs had been chosen for their softness instead of their stackability. Volunteers hummed, learned the sideways hold, practiced the pat. Sometimes men in suits came and stood at the door and tried to clap without being heard, which is a comical thing to watch. They left having understood something money had never explained before. Leah stood in that room one afternoon, months to go before Singapore, her life a long hallway with a door open at the end. The shawl lay folded on a shelf above the sink with a small note. "Borrow me when you need me. Return me when someone else does." She hummed to a baby whose name she did not ask, because sometimes names made leaving hard. She knew astonishingly that her singing was not magic. It was practice. It was care. It was showing up and letting yourself be looked at by strangers when you are tired and still doing the work. Cyrus visited sometimes with Noah without cameras. He would stand in a corner out of the way, his arms full of a child who had learned by then that airplanes could be boring, and that quiet was a gift obnoxiously withheld by teeth and arrival announcements. He would look at Leah and say very little because some thanks, if overwatered, die. One day, when the Foundation's ribbon cutting for a second lullaby room took place at a rural clinic that smelled of rain and wood smoke, Leah sang the song her mother had sung the night the electricity went out, but the laughter did not. She sang beside a woman who had been awake for 42 hours, and a father who flinched when the baby flinched, and then visibly resolved not to do it again. Her voice was not loud. It did not have to be. It carried like a hand extended across a ditch. Later, people would tell the story of the girl on the plane. They would twist it into shapes that fit their own lives. Strangers will help you if you let them. Rich men sometimes listen. Grief can be tuned to something like music. They would get things wrong in the shareable way. Stories always get things wrong. It would be said that the girl sang so beautifully the baby had no choice but to sleep, when in truth the trick had been a shush beside an ear, and a smell carried forward. It would be said that the man gave her everything, when in truth he gave her only the thing she needed, and then stepped back. Years later, when Leah stood in a practice room in Singapore where the panes of glass leaned over a small patch of trees, she would lay the shawl on the back of a chair like a flag. In a studio where she was supposed to learn sonata form and modulation, she would unlearn the need to be perfect and relearn the need to be kind. She would compose a piece for strings and soft percussion that sounded like engines and wind and someone humming in the dark. She would dedicate it to the people in the little rooms who make the big rooms livable. And somewhere, on some flight she would never take, a baby would begin to cry as if the world were ending. A mother or a father would panic. A flight attendant would glance at the galley and the seatbelt sign, and the crowds gathered impatience. A shy person who had not planned to be brave that day would stand because feet sometimes decide before hearts approve. They would drape a jacket over the little creature the way a shawl had once been draped over a boy named Noah, and they would make a sound like surf. They would watch as the impossible thing happened again. The world got small enough to soften. On the night before Leah left for school, the neighborhood gathered at their usual unappointed place where the alley widened and someone's front step made a stage. Her father grilled fish and made fun of himself for oversalting. Little kids ran with sparklers drawing lines in the air. Older aunties argued about whether somebody was too thin. The radio her father had been coaxing back to life sputtered into a clear song, and the whole crowd cheered. Cyrus came, though nobody had told him to. He brought Noah, who toddled in shoes that made squeaks the manufacturer swore were charming, and a huge paper bag of empanadas he did not know how to carry with casualness. He hugged Leah's father like men who had decided to be brothers in the long way, the way that requires a pile of small kindnesses instead of one dramatic one. He looked ridiculous. In a T-shirt that said, "Barangay Basketball Champions 2003, and nobody let him forget it all night. When the music paused, Leah sang. not for show and not to say goodbye. She refused to say goodbye to people who lived inside her. She sang to say what words could not make plain. Her voice threaded through the alley and over the laundry lines and laced itself around ankles and wrists and throats. Noah stared up at her and, after a moment, put his head on his father's shoulder. Cyrus closed his eyes. For a minute, the past and the future lay down together like two tired warriors and let the song stand guard. On planes after that, whenever the overhead lights dimmed and a child protested the audacity, people on board carried themselves differently, not because a billionaire had started something, not because a program had been endowed, not because an article had gone viral, because a story had walked among them and asked them to remember they had hands and voices and shawls and sayings and patience in pockets they'd forgotten to turn out. You expect the world's unthinkable acts to be monumental, buildings lifted, rivers turned back, but often they're so small they slip under doors. A shy girl stands up and walks forward when a room is trying to look away. A baby takes a breath and then another. A man who once believed that impact and importance were synonyms learns to tell them apart. The song that comes from it has no verses and no chorus and will not be captured on the kind of recording devices the world likes to sell. It is sung ear to ear, shawl to shoulder, hand to hand. It is sung for one person at a time and somehow also for everyone. And on some night much later, Leah would be on a plane again, going home between semesters, the lights a river beneath them, and the cabin a hush. Across the aisle, a mother would stand with a familiar desperation, her blouse stained with the universal. The crying would lift the hairs along Leah's arms, not with annoyance, but recognition. She would smile to herself, dig into her bag, and pull out a different cloth. Nothing special, just cotton that had touched years. She would rise without thinking. "May I?" she would ask softly, because that was always the beginning, and permission the purest form of power she had ever known. And mischief would rise in her, that tiny brave thing, and she would add, as if confessing a secret to the airplane itself, "I've done this before."